I've shared bits and pieces of my story through messages and those sorts of things, so I'm confident that you will have heard some of these things. I asked Karen if she could find... My dad wrote a book a couple of years ago called Things I Remember, Things That He Remembered, and I was going to read part of that out, but for some reason I can't find the book at the moment, so you're going to have to wait for another story. But I grew up in a Christian home, and where my mum and dad were heavily involved in church life. I was christened as a child, and I really can't remember ever not believing in God, although I didn't always walk with God. And I grew up with a fairly simplistic faith and understanding. Went to Sunday school, went to youth group and all those sorts of things. But as a child, I was quite sickly. I spent a considerable amount of time in and out of hospitals. I had numerous bouts of bronchitis and asthma, and 2 or 3 times I was in there with pneumonia. And there was one particular time at the age of 10, I can remember quite distinctly. It was Christmas Day, or Christmas time, it was Christmas holidays. And everybody else went off to church, and except I stayed at home with my mum because I was too sick to go. And I remember them coming home from church, bringing home the pastor. And he came in and asked whether I believed that God could heal me. And as a 10-year-old, I didn't have any doubt about that at all, and I didn't really know what was really going on. But I found out later that the doctors had only given me a very short period of time to live, and they were quite concerned about some things. I had numerous things going on in my life as far as health goes, which at the time I was quite unaware of. I would pass out at school, faint, if I was standing up doing a lecturette or anything like that. I can count at least 3 that I can remember, times where the ambulance was called and I found myself in hospital, which used to ping me off. Because I was always in hospital and I really didn't enjoy hospital, and I do have still an aversion to doctors, and I hate going to the doctors and I hate going to hospital. But in those times I was quite unaware of what was going on. And in the book that Dad wrote a couple of years ago, I realised just how significant that was to them. And there was a few things that happened at that time that I was healed completely of at that time, at Christmas time. Well, I thought it was a normal life. It really wasn't probably as normal as what it probably should have been. And so when I was 13, even after all of that sorted itself out, I remember my parents, or my younger siblings, had been sent off to a day camp, and I was too old at 13 because I was in high school. And I think I've shared this story in part of it, at least in a sermon, but I found a packet of detonators in Dad's garage, and I knew what detonators were. I knew that they went bang, and I thought they would be a great thing to play with, because if you hit them with a hammer, they'd be like a big cap gun, and you can get a big bang out of them. Well, I couldn't find a hammer. I found the box of detonators, but I couldn't find a hammer anywhere, and I was a bit annoyed at myself because I wanted to really see how much of a bang they made. And I did find an old iron, the type of iron that used to sit on top of the stove and you heat it up and then iron. It was a steel iron. And I decided that I would use that instead of a hammer. And to make it more effective, I would use the point rather than the flat, because, of course, if you're going to hit it, you've got to hit it with a point. So I did that. I found the detonator and I kept hitting it, and I flattened 2 completely flat. And I figured that they were dead and duds, and I thought, well, if I flatten all of them, I could probably make something out of them. But the third one went off with a great bang. Now I got a significant fright, but I thought, I'm in trouble. That was my immediate reaction. I'm in trouble. And so my mum was the only one at home. My siblings were at the camp, and Dad was up the farm. And so rather than getting into trouble, I ran and I hid. And I knew I hear my mum calling my name everywhere around the house, trying to find me while I didn't come out, because I knew I was going to get into trouble. Eventually I did come out, but what I didn't realise is that the gunpowder from the detonator had sprinkled over my face, and I had blood pouring down my face, and I had blood on my right hand. I still got gunpowder in my wrist. And so when she saw me, she actually freaked out more, and I got into bigger trouble. But I was bundled up and put in the car and taken off to hospital again, and where I spent the next week with the nurses sitting in a bath of stuff. I don't know what the stuff was, but they would take me out twice a day, sit me in this bath full of antiseptic stuff, and with needles start pricking out the gunpowder out of my face and out of my arm, so that they could get rid of the gunpowder, and I hated that as well. Anyway, I was in hospital again not too long after that, about 3 weeks later actually, only this time my brother was in hospital with me, and we both had bronchitis and at the time, and I don't know why. I was just a really good brother, I guess, but we found a piece of chewing gum, chewed up chewing gum on the ground, and I stuck it in my brother's hair. He pulled it out and left this big bald patch. He keeps reminding me that's why he's gone bald quicker than I have. But we're in hospital quite regularly, not together, but I found myself in hospital quite often. So that was another time where I see now, looking back, where God actually blessed or was overshadowing my life in so many ways. And again, talking with my mum and dad, they actually can count numerous times where I probably should have been a lot more seriously hurt than what I certainly am, what I was at the time. So my upbringing, or my younger life, revolved around hospital visits, and as such I was never very good at school. I struggled in school because I was often more away from school, even right up until my grade 12 year. I had spent, I left school at the middle of grade 12 because I'd got an apprenticeship as an electrician at that time, and I left the day that exams were starting, end semester exams of the first semester. I didn't do them, but they'd already told me I didn't have to do them because I'd missed 2 months of the 3 months of school, or 3 months of school or something of the 6 months. So it was that was my life. Right up until, I guess it was just before I left school, when I was 16, something significant happened. We had a youth group. I attended a youth group every fortnight. Youth group was 1 week. We had what we called Christian Endeavour alternate weeks, which was a youth Bible study. So youth group was 1 week, CE was second, and I was part of that, and because of my upbringing, that's where I ended up going. It was also, as a teenager, I was involved in a singing group which went around a lot of places called the One Way Crusaders. We recorded an album, CD, cassette. No, it wasn't a CD, cassette tape, which I think we have on CD now somehow at home. But that's where I kind of got more connected with Karen, because Karen's mum was the one that was actually organising the One Way Crusaders. And we would go to all sorts of places. We went to Biggenden and Gayndah and I don't know, I couldn't remember them. Karen probably remembers them more than I did. But we had a lot of good fun and a good time. But it was where I probably got to know Karen a little bit. Karen started to come to youth group, and we started dating a little bit later down the track. But that's where we connected. But we had many weekends away and those sorts of things with the One Way Crusaders, but each afternoon after school we would get dropped off at the bus stop, and there was about 4 or 5 of us that would walk home from the bus stop to home. It was about a 2.5 kilometre walk. Sometimes we would ride our bikes, but more often than not we would walk, because if you rode your bike, you had to ride your bike in the morning, whereas I caught the bus at 8:10, and I would wake up at 8 o'clock, and in order to get there in time, Mum had to drive me. So it was drive to the bus stop. That meant I have to walk home, because I did like my sleeping, and they would usually laugh about that. But one afternoon it happened. I don't know even how it happened. I was the only one walking home. The others that would normally come on that trip obviously we had hockey training and those sorts of things at school sometimes, but it seemed this afternoon I was the only one walking home. And I remember this afternoon quite distinctly. I'd been questioning, I guess, or not too much questioning, but doubting, I guess, the essence of God's reality in my life. And I can remember very clearly out loud in an audible voice saying, Lord, God, if you're there, I need to know that you're real and that you're there. I began to talk to myself, to God, and telling him all this stuff. And I can only describe what I experienced at that time as a kind of a vision, but it wasn't in any sense. Well, it was. What happened was I saw myself at that moment standing in front of about 1,500 teenagers, sharing the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ with them. I can picture the hall in my mind to this day. I can see faces in that hall, and I can remember feeling extremely confident. And as I was talking out loud on the walk home, I was just telling stuff about Jesus Christ that I probably should not have even realised, or I didn't know what I was even saying. I was on a little bit of a high and recognised very quickly, obviously, that something significant had happened. And God, I believe, at that point in time, showed me or gave me, or I sense, a call to certainly to youth work. And I felt that very strongly, that God wanted me in ministry to talk specifically with the youth. And so I went home. I eventually got home, and I remember I was on a bit of a high, and I said to my mum, I explained a little bit. I just told her a little bit of what happened, and I'll never forget her words, because it was probably the least thing I expected her to say. But I told Mum, and she said, "That's lovely, son. Now get in and do your homework." And I thought, oh. And she didn't mean it like that, but that's what I heard. And over the next few months, we had a few extra conversations. But what I did find out was that by the end of that year, our youth group leader had decided, and I spoke to my youth leader about all of this, but he decided that he was going to step down out of youth leadership. And I was in grade 12 at the time, and he said, "Would you like to, or 11, and would you like to take over our youth group?" And I didn't really want to do that, but I did say yes. And so at the age of 17, by the time that all turned around, I started leading youth group and found myself in a position where I was not equipped. I loved the games nights. I hated the devotion side of it. And I was probably fairly renowned for doing some wild and wacky games, and we had a ton of fun. It was easy to get youth to put their heads in toilet bowls and pull out chocolate bars. We did that many times, and they loved it and asked for it over and over again. We had times where I made some green goop, and it was made out of applesauce, green food colouring, and I made bucket loads of it and mixed it up with my feet, and then they ate it. And they didn't know I'd mixed it up with my feet until much later. And no one got sick. We didn't have any problems with any of those sort of risk management things back then, but we had a lot of fun in youth group. But it was also during that time that the game side of things started to wear a bit thin, and I discovered that I really fell in love with the devotion side of it, and my walk with the Lord started to grow. And I couldn't have been probably less prepared for youth ministry at that time than I was. But God used me, and we had so much good time, quality time. And over the next, I was leading that youth group until I left when I was 45. And we never stopped, never missed a Friday night. We went through so many good times and camps and excursions, and I remember coming up to Yeppoon when I called to Yeppoon, and I had withdrawal, and so much so that we decided that, and because we didn't have a church here at the time, our first youth group night was at our house, and I think Jasmine was part of that, and it was the first night that we had our youth group at our place, and where I first got to meet her, and obviously that was early in our ministry here. So for the next X number of years, youth group and was really excited, was part of my life. Karen and I got married in 1985, and we had Kelly. Kelly was born in 1986, and Simon was born in 88, and Jono in 92. And I got caught up, I guess. I knew the call of the youth ministry was on my life, but I did get caught up in family, and we also started a new business. Had my own business doing white good repairs, and we had a number of people working for us at the time. And so life got really complicated, or busy, more so than complicated, and I spent a lot more time doing those things than I did probably on anything else. And when I was about 26, 27, I remember Reverend Stan Baker came and asked me. He was our pastor at the time, and he said, "I'd really like you to preach one Sunday morning." And I freaked out at that and told him no, I wasn't going to do it, because I was too young and had no idea of what to tell people that were much older than me, and there was probably some people in the church seats that should have been up preaching before me. And I've heard that said back to me, and I know that's how I felt, and I can't explain to you how guilty I felt. I felt relieved that I didn't have to do it, but there was a tremendous amount of guilt because I knew I should have. And I guess I didn't really get the chance then, but when I was 35, actually I struggled at 33 because I felt I'd got to 33 and I hadn't achieved anything in my life that I believed God had wanted me to do. And Jesus Christ was put to the cross at 33, and he was able to say, "It's finished." And I felt tremendous guilt again because I hadn't done what I knew I was supposed to do. And it was a couple of years later, 35, 36, the opportunity came up for me to study again. And I was just sitting in a regular church service. We had a visiting pastor. He was speaking from Titus. But I was sitting in the front seat. I generally sat in the front seat because I was usually leading worship or part of the worship team. And God spoke to me very, very clearly that morning. And I don't know what happened. I don't know what he spoke about specifically, but I can remember very clearly that God said to me that you need to get ready and get your studies completed. And I had no idea what that meant. And I was a little bit nervous about what it was about, because in the church that we attended, the sound desk was down the back, but up on the next level. We had a little room up top, which the sound desk was in. And after the service, I had said nothing to anybody, but the guy that was on the sound desk came down to me and he said to me, "God spoke to you this morning, didn't he?" And I was gobsmacked. I said, and his name was Wes. I said, "Wes, yes, he did. What did he say?" Because I was a bit dubious. And I'll never forget Wes's comments. He said, "I don't know what he said to you, but whatever he said, you need to be doing." And that stuck with me. And on the way home from church that morning, I told Karen that I believed I needed to get my studies done. And that's the point which she said, "What are you going to do with it? Are you not going to be a pastor, are you?" And I said, "No, I don't think that's what God wants me to do." She said, "Good, because I don't want to be a pastor's wife." And that stuck with her and me ever since. And we've learned very quickly that we don't say we don't want to do something, because that's normally where we end up being. So for those that are thinking about ministry, don't say no. You better say yes and then just follow it along, because it'll happen anyway. But that was the point. And so I did. I started to study and found out what I needed to do in order to be licensed as a minister. I wasn't sure that I wanted to be in pastoral ministry. I still believed that I was going to be involved in youth ministry in some way, and still believe that that's still where God has me in some ways doing that. And that's one of the reasons I love going to high school camp. But that aside, I started my studies within the month. And by the following year, I had done pretty much all the studies required for licensing. Now, again, even at that point, I had no idea what I was studying for or why I should be studying at all. And out of the blue, I guess in some ways I kind of half expected it, but really out of the blue, we had Rex Rigby, who was the district superintendent, up here come and visit us to ask whether I would consider coming to Yeppoon to pastor the church. Now, I've got to tell you, when he said that, that was the furthest thing from my mind. I didn't feel equipped to do that. I could probably, I know I've spoken with Jasmine about this she has far more studies under her belt now than when I had then when I came to Yeppoon. But I said yes, that I would come and have an interview, because I'd learned then by that stage that I had to just trust God on this. And that's came through, I guess, from that point on, from in Karen's and my ministry life, was to trust God in whatever took place. And so we said yes to coming up here for an interview. The interview took place, and I only let 3 people know that we were coming up. One was my boss, who was not a Christian. One was my mum and dad, or my mum and dad, I guess that's 2, but they were my mum and dad, and another fellow in our church who we deeply respected, who's now passed away. And so those 3 people knew that we were coming up here for the possibility that we might come to Yeppoon. And each one of them said, "Oh, you'll know by the time you come up, you finished up there." And the trouble was we didn't. And we came up, we left, and while perhaps deep down, maybe I did, I felt that, it wasn't that clear. I needed to put the sheepskin out somewhere else, the fleece out somewhere else, and do that. So we had Jonathan with us in that trip up originally. And Jono came up, and on the way home, we're back about Mum or somewhere, and we were talking about the trip, and asked him, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well, I'm not going." "Why not?" "I don't want to go. I've got all my friends in Gympie at school," and so that was playing on our heart a little bit as well. We had 2 weeks. We got a letter shortly after inviting us to come. We had 2 weeks to make our mind up, and again, I wanted to put it off. And I had internal memories of the time I was asked to preach, and I left it till the very last day to let them know that we would come, and I still didn't know what that meant. But what that did mean was that Jonathan wasn't coming, neither were any of our children, in fact, and they decided that they would... Jono was finishing grade 10 that year. He was going into grade 11. Simon had finished school. Kellyanne decided... at the exactly same time we were moving up here, that she was going to America to do a thing with uni. She was doing her uni degree in journalism, and there was a youth exchange kind of thing that went over there. And so she left about a week before we left to come up here, and there was a lot of tears and struggle at that point, knowing that she was coming home to no parents at home. But we did. We came up here. We left our children. I don't know if that was the smartest thing we have ever done, but we believed there was a process that we went through, which I won't bore you with now, but bit by bit God showed us that he could take care of things. And one of the most significant, perhaps, and I have shared this, is my boss, who was not a Christian. I told him I was coming up here, and he said, "Well, that's what you should do." He says, "That's what you've been studying for. Why wouldn't you?" And that, for me, was probably the biggest confirmation. Him saying that, and even now today we have, he always called me Reverend Ronnie, even before I was ordained, even before I was anything, because he knew I was studying, and he would introduce me to all the reps that would come in as Reverend Ron, and it was a little embarrassing to start with, but it kind of was one of those things I thought, you know what, we take advantage of that. And Saturday mornings, it used to be only him and I that would work, and for a long, long time that we'd start work at 7 on Saturday, and first thing we did, he said, "Go and put the kettle on," and we'd put the kettle on, and we'd sit down with a cup of coffee at the lunch table. Generally there was not too many customers that would come in at that time, and he would ask me questions about the Bible, trying to trick me up, doing all the questions about how old is God and where did he come from, and all those sorts of things. But they went on for months and months and months. We had lots of conversations, and last time, it was the time before that we were down there, called in to see him, and I remember him saying to the guy that took over my job when I left, he said, "This is Reverend Ronnie. He's up looking after the church in Yeppoon. He's probably forgotten more than you've ever learned in fixing power tools." And that was a little bit of something to me that I thought, you know what, we have a good rapport with him, and there's things that he remembers. So God used us in those times, and that time when I was working for him wasn't an easy time, but it was a time of preparation for coming to Yeppoon in some ways. But I did the time, enough studies, and then when I came up here eventually I had to complete my studies externally, and just as Jasmine's doing now, I continued on with my studies. Again, I will tell you today that Jasmine's done more study than I have, in that I did not have to do an advanced diploma, which she is doing at the moment, and a postgrad cert that she's already started on as well. And so in many ways God has used my life in those things, in history of my own business, and to be able to work with people. So I don't want to bore you anymore, but I just want to, when I was 53, it struck me, and I think I've shared this too with some. I hadn't realised that I had never been had a believer's baptism. I was christened as a baby, but I had never had a believer's baptism, and I was 53, and felt a tremendous burden to do that. I remember sitting out here on the veranda, or standing out there in the veranda with a bucket of water, thinking I can just baptise myself, and I can just tip it over me and I'll be right. But that was too cold. So, and we didn't do that. So I rang Pastor Stewart as our district superintendent and asked what I could do or should do, and we talked about the possibility of doing that, and I was baptised 3 years ago now, up in Mackay at our pastors and leaders retreat with all the pastors of our district there, and I shared my story with them, and I was baptised in a pool at the place we were staying up there. It was a difficult decision because part of me wanted to do it with our church family, and another part of me was arguing about the fact that how do I do that in my church family. And I love you guys so much, but I felt the need to do that with those who were in authority over me was where I should be. And that was a battle for some time as I did that. But so through that act of obedience, I again re-acknowledged my trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. And I got to tell you that there's not a day that goes by that I do not feel so inadequate for the job, the role that He has put me in here. I've been blessed, Karen and I have been blessed so much. There were so many things that changed in our life when we moved from Gympie to Yeppoon. We had 2 incomes. We went down to 1. We've never been in want while we've been here at all. I'm going to say we lost our children, but we left our children back in Gympie, and coming up as a couple who had their children, we felt like we'd walked out on them, and they found us again. But we did enjoy the 2 years without them for a little while, but they found us again one by one, and it's been a blessing to now have our family very, very close here in Gladstone. And so I just want to acknowledge that God has been with me and Karen. And when we got married, we were married quite young. Karen was 19, I was 22. Kelly was born when Karen was 20. And you can work out the rest of them because I gave you the dates. But the whole process has been that God has been with us every step. And the times and I guess this carries on a little bit from this morning with Jasmine when she was sharing, the times when we have been, I guess, disobedient, or I have been disobedient, God has not forgotten about it. And there have been so many times when I could look back now and remember that God has been with us. And I don't remember in detail like my mum and dad do about my illnesses when I was younger, but I do remember the things that we've gone through as a couple and as a family. And there have never been a time when we have been in want. There's been times when we've not had everything we've wanted, but God has provided every time. And I remember so many times there was food left on our back steps when we didn't have any money for groceries, and that just happened. I just finish off with one little story quickly, because there was Jenny Beer. You know Jenny. She came up with Troy and Stephanie last time. Jenny was Jenny Baker before she got married, and she was in a youth group, and she loved cooking. And so Stan, her dad, was our pastor, and he was the one that asked me to preach. But she knew I'd like chocolate cakes, and she'd cooked chocolate cake one afternoon. And Karen and I weren't home, and she left it on our back landing. Only when we got home, we found that the cat had already got into the cake and eaten it. So we never actually got it, but we didn't. I don't think we didn't tell Jenny for a long time that we didn't eat that cake. She knows now, and we laugh about it. But Jenny was just a really good friend, and she used to babysit our children when when they were young and she was a teenager, and so we got to be with them family. So I just tonight want to just acknowledge God in my life as well, and not to take away anything from Michelle, because the stories could probably not be so any different, and because my mum and dad are still alive, I still get to see them regularly. We talk to them. I will ring my dad tonight. I ring him every Sunday night, and just enjoy that. So I just felt I wanted to share that with you guys tonight, just that part of the story, and to let you know that God is faithful, and He will not let you go without, and He will keep you. If He has placed a call on your life, don't doubt it. You might question it a little bit, I'm sure, but don't doubt that He will see it through. I could tell you so many stories about how He has been faithful in seeing my life and Karen's life through to where we stand today. And so I don't know what the future holds. As I said, day by day, it's about trusting Him and knowing Him and seeing where He leads me. I'm not a good student. In what I mean by that is I don't enjoy study. I find that really, really difficult. As I said, I wasn't really a smart child at school. Although God used other areas, I have found myself fairly good with my hands, and that's why I had an apprenticeship rather than going to university. My 3 siblings all went to uni, and I've always felt that I was the dummy of the families, although I was the eldest. But God has been faithful in that, and He has watched over us. And I love my family, I love my wife, I love my children, grandkids, and they've all chosen wonderful spouses, and God has blessed Karen and I so much, and I'm grateful in what He has done. And I'm grateful for you as our church family, because when we left our church family in the Mary Valley to come up here, we knew nobody really. We knew absolutely nobody, and yet here I am wishing when we go away, the thing I want to do is get back to my church family. And you've been such a blessing to us, and continue to be so. So thank you for that.